The last time Elijah Cross slept under a roof that belonged to someone who loved him, he was 7 years old. That was 11 years ago, and the roof belonged to his grandfather, a quiet, sun-darkened man named Walter Cross who smelled of pipe tobacco and wet soil and who had hands so rough they could sand wood without paper. Elijah remembered those hands. He remembered the way they would close around his small fingers as they walked through the orchard together, row after row of ancient apple and pear trees stretching across 42 acres of hill country in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. He remembered the sound of his grandfather's boots on the packed earth between the trees, and the way Walter would stop sometimes and press his palm flat against the bark of a trunk, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. But that was before Elijah's mother, Diane, pulled him out of Walter's farmhouse in the middle of the night, threw him into the back seat of a Greyhound bus, and told him they were never going back. Elijah never understood why. Diane never explained. She was a woman who moved through life like a brush fire, scorching everything behind her and never looking back. She dragged Elijah from city to city, boyfriend to boyfriend, each one worse than the last. By the time he was 12, he had lived in 9 different apartments across 4 states. By the time he was 15, Diane had married Carl Brecker, a man with a car dealership in Roanoke and a temper that could curdle milk. Carl didn't want a stepson. He made that abundantly clear. He wanted Diane, specifically the version of Diane that laughed at his jokes and didn't ask questions about the money. Elijah was a complication, a mouth to feed, a pair of eyes watching from the hallway when Carl's voice got too loud and Diane's got too quiet. On the morning of Elijah's 18th birthday, Carl handed him a garbage bag and told him to pack. Diane stood behind Carl in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. She didn't say happy birthday. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything at all. Elijah packed the garbage bag in 6 minutes. He owned so little that it didn't even fill halfway. A change of clothes, a toothbrush, a phone with a cracked screen and no service plan, and a photograph. The photograph was the only thing that mattered. It was a Polaroid, sun-faded and dog-eared, showing a 7-year-old boy sitting on the shoulders of a tall, lean man in a straw hat, both of them laughing, an ocean of green apple trees rolling out behind them toward a blue Virginia sky. On the back, in pencil, Walter had written, "Eli and me. Orchard Day, 1913 trees and counting." Elijah walked out the front door of Carl Brecker's split-level ranch house and didn't look back. He heard the deadbolt click behind him before he reached the sidewalk. For the next 4 months, Elijah lived the way tens of thousands of teenagers in America live and no one talks about. He slept in the doorways of churches when the weather was warm and in the back seats of unlocked cars when it wasn't. He ate from gas station dumpsters, learning quickly which ones threw out the day-old sandwiches at 9 in the evening and which ones poured bleach over the bags. He washed his face in public restroom sinks and dried his hands on his jeans. He walked. He walked constantly, miles and miles a day, because standing still in one place too long attracted attention, and attention meant police. And police meant questions he couldn't answer without someone calling Diane, and Diane meant Carl, and Carl meant a door slamming in his face all over again. There were nights when the loneliness was so total that Elijah would sit on a park bench and talk to Walter's Polaroid, whispering into the dark about the cold or the hunger or the way a cashier had looked at him like he was invisible. He never asked the photograph for anything. He just talked, the way he used to talk to Walter while they walked the rows, filling the silence with small, ordinary words because the sound of his own voice was the only proof he had that he still existed. It was during one of those long, aimless walks through downtown Roanoke in late October that Elijah's phone buzzed. He had found a charger at a public library and had plugged in the cracked device out of habit more than hope. The notification was an email, routed through a free account he had set up years ago to sign up for things that required an address. The subject line read, "Urgent, Estate of Walter M. Cross, legal notification." Elijah stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk outside a shuttered furniture store, the cold October wind cutting through his thin hoodie, and stared at the words on the cracked screen until they blurred. Walter, his grandfather. He opened the email with a thumb that wouldn't stop shaking. It was from a law office in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Macklin, Torres, and Webb, attorneys at law. The message was brief and formal, but the words hit Elijah like a freight train. It informed him that Walter Marshall Cross had passed away on September 14th. That Walters will had named Elijah James Cross as the sole heir to the entirety of his estate, consisting of a 42-acre agricultural property known locally as the Cross Orchard, located in the unincorporated community of Elkton, Rockingham County, Virginia. That the estate was encumbered by approximately $87,000 in delinquent property taxes, structural condemnation notices from the county, and an active dispute with a neighboring commercial land developer. And that if Elijah did not present himself at the offices of Macklin, Torres, and Webb within 30 days to accept or decline the inheritance, the property would be surrendered to the county for public auction. Elijah read the email 3 times. Then he sat down on the cold sidewalk, put his face in his hands, and cried for the first time in years. He didn't cry because of the property or the money or the debt. He cried because Walter was dead. The only person who had ever made him feel like he belonged to something was gone, and Elijah hadn't even known. He hadn't been there. He hadn't said goodbye. And the guilt of that, the specific, sharp-edged guilt of abandoning someone who never abandoned you, was worse than anything Carl Brecker had ever done to him. The next morning, Elijah hitchhiked 63 miles to Harrisonburg. He arrived at the law office of Macklin, Torres, and Webb looking exactly like what he was. A homeless teenager in a wrinkled hoodie with dirt under his fingernails and a garbage bag over his shoulder. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked at him the way people always looked at him. Like he was in the wrong place. Like he should leave before someone called security. But Elijah had learned something valuable in 4 months on the street. He had learned that the world would always assume the worst about him, and that the only weapon he had was the willingness to stand still and not flinch. He told the receptionist his name. He told her he had an appointment. And when she checked the calendar and found that he did, the look on her face shifted from suspicion to something closer to pity, which was worse. The attorney handling Walter's estate was a woman named Grace Torres. She was in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and reading glasses that she wore pushed up on her forehead like a second pair of eyes. Her office was small and cluttered, the desk buried under files and coffee-stained legal pads, but her handshake was firm and her gaze was steady and kind. She gestured for Elijah to sit. He did, placing his garbage bag carefully on the floor beside the chair. Miss Torres studied him for a moment, then opened a thick manila folder. She told Elijah what he already knew from the email, but she filled in the details, and the details changed everything. Walter Cross had lived alone on the orchard property for the last 40 years. He had been a quiet, private man, deeply distrustful of banks, lawyers, and the government. He had no friends in the traditional sense, though the handful of old-timers in Elkton who remembered him spoke of him with a respect that bordered on reverence. He had maintained the orchard single-handedly until his late 70s, when his body began to fail him. In the last decade of his life, the property had fallen into severe disrepair. The farmhouse roof had partially collapsed. The barn had been condemned. The orchard itself, once one of the most productive heritage apple orchards in the Shenandoah Valley, had gone wild, the trees unpruned and overgrown, the irrigation ditches clogged with silt and debris. The county had been pressuring Walter for years to sell, citing safety violations and unpaid taxes, but Walter had refused every offer, every threat, and every incentive with the same quiet, immovable stubbornness. He had died in the farmhouse, alone, in September. A mail carrier had noticed the smell. Grace Torres paused. She removed her glasses and looked directly at Elijah. There was something else she needed him to understand, she said. The property was not just neglected. It was actively contested. A company called Ridgeline Partners, a commercial development firm based in Charlottesville, had been trying to acquire the Cross Orchard and several adjacent parcels for nearly 15 years. Their plan was to build a large-scale distribution center and logistics hub along the Route 33 corridor. They had successfully purchased every surrounding property, but Walter had refused to sell, and without the Cross Orchard, the project could not proceed. The firm's managing partner, a man named Victor Hale, had personally visited Walter on multiple occasions. According to county records, Hale had offered Walter as much as $2 million for the land, a sum that Walter had reportedly rejected without explanation. Since Walter's death, Ridgeline Partners had filed a preemptive claim with the county assessor's office, arguing that the delinquent taxes and condemnation orders gave them standing to acquire the property at public auction for the assessed value of the land alone, which, stripped of any improvement value, was approximately $180,000. If Elijah did not claim the inheritance and clear the tax debt within 30 days, the property would go to auction. Ridgeline Partners would almost certainly be the only serious bidder. Elijah sat very still. He looked at the photograph in his hand, the one he carried everywhere, the Polaroid of a boy on an old man's shoulders with an orchard stretching out behind them. He looked up at Grace Torres. "How much are the back taxes exactly?" he asked. Torres checked the file. $87,000 for $112, she said, and 31 cents. Elijah almost laughed. He had $11 in his pocket and a garbage bag full of clothes. But he also had something that no one in that law office, no one at Ridgeline Partners, and certainly no one in the Brecker household would have predicted. He had his grandfather's stubbornness. "I want the property," Elijah said. Torres blinked. "Mr. Cross," she began carefully, choosing her words with the diplomatic precision of someone who had delivered bad news professionally for decades. "I want to be honest with you. Even if you accept the inheritance, you would need to satisfy the tax lien within 30 days, or the county will proceed with the auction regardless. And the property itself, in its current condition, is essentially uninhabitable. There is no functioning electricity, no water service, and the main structure has been red tagged by the building inspector. Taking this on would be an enormous burden for anyone, let alone someone in your current circumstances." "I understand," Elijah said. "I want the property." Torres looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, pulled a set of documents from the folder, and slid them across the desk. She pointed to the lines that required his signature. It took 4 signatures and an hour of paperwork. When it was done, Elijah James Cross was the legal owner of 42 acres of condemned, tax-delinquent, overgrown orchard land in Elkton, Virginia, and he had exactly 30 days and $11 to figure out how to keep it. He hitched a ride to Elkton that afternoon. The driver was a retired poultry farmer named Earl who talked nonstop about the Nationals' bullpen problems and didn't ask Elijah a single personal question, which Elijah appreciated more than the man would ever know. Earl dropped him at the intersection of Route 33 and a dirt road that wound up into the hills. The mailbox at the end of the road said Cross in hand-painted letters, the white paint flaking and sun-bleached to near invisibility. Elijah walked up the road with his garbage bag over his shoulder and the manila envelope of legal documents tucked under his arm. The orchard announced itself before the house did. The trees came first, hundreds of them, stretching out across the hillside in rows that had once been perfectly straight but were now tangled and anarchic, branches interlocking overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a ruined cathedral. The leaves were turning, gold and amber and deep arterial red, and the ground beneath the trees was carpeted with fallen fruit, thousands of apples in various stages of rot, filling the air with a smell that was equal parts sweet and sour, like cider left too long in the sun. Elijah stopped walking. He stood at the edge of the orchard and pressed his hand against the rough bark of the nearest tree, the way he had watched Walter do 1,000 times as a boy. The bark was cold and damp under his palm. He closed his eyes. He could almost hear the old man's voice, low and unhurried, explaining that this tree was a wine sap, planted in 1919, and that tree was an Arkansas black, the hardest apple in the world, and if you pressed your ear to the trunk in spring you could hear the sap moving. Elijah opened his eyes. The farmhouse was visible now, at the top of the hill, framed against a sky the color of bruised plums. It was worse than he had imagined. The structure was a 2-story clapboard farmhouse, built sometime in the early 1900s, and it looked as though it had been slowly surrendering to gravity for the last 20 years. The porch roof had collapsed entirely on the left side, dragging a section of the second-floor wall with it. The windows on the ground floor were boarded with plywood that had warped and split. The chimney leaned at an angle that defied architectural logic. The yard around the house was a wilderness of waist-high weeds, rusted farm equipment, and collapsed outbuildings. A barn, or what had once been a barn, sat 50 yards to the south, its roof caved in and its walls bowed outward like the ribs of a dead animal. Elijah walked up to the front porch, testing each step before putting his weight on it. The front door was unlocked. It opened with a groan that sounded almost human. Inside, the house smelled of mildew, mouse droppings, and the faint, ghostly residue of pipe tobacco. The furniture was still there, old and heavy and covered in dust, as if Walter had simply stopped living one day and the house had continued aging without him. The kitchen table still held a coffee mug and an open Bible, both coated in a fine layer of gray dust. Elijah set his garbage bag on the floor. He stood in the center of the kitchen and looked around. The ceiling above him was stained with water damage, and he could see daylight through a gap in the roof over the stairwell. The linoleum floor was buckled and cracked. A family of mice had built a nest inside the oven. This was his inheritance. This was everything Walter had protected for 40 years, everything he had refused to sell, everything he had chosen over comfort and companionship and common sense. This ruin, this beautiful, stubborn, collapsing ruin. Elijah pulled the Bible toward him and opened it to the page Walter had been reading when he died. A small rectangle of paper fluttered out from between the thin pages and landed on the table. It was a note, written in Walter's careful, blocky handwriting. The letters pressed deep into the paper as if the pen were a chisel. It said, "Eli, if you come back, don't sell. Not for any price. They want the land, but they don't know what's under it. Go to the old pump house. Count 12 rows east from the winesap mother tree. Look for the stone that doesn't belong. What I buried for you. 1974, don't let them take it. Love, Grandpa Walt." Elijah read the note 5 times. His hands were steady, but his heart was slamming against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket, next to the Polaroid. Then he walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the orchard, at the hundreds of ancient trees rolling down the hillside in their tangled, overgrown rows, their branches heavy with unpicked fruit and their roots buried deep in soil that had held the Cross family for over a century. Somewhere out there, 12 rows east of a tree his grandfather had planted before Elijah was born, something was waiting. Something buried in 1974. Something that Walter Cross had guarded with his life and his silence and his refusal to sell, even when the taxes piled up and the roof caved in and the world told him he was a crazy old man living alone in a ruin. Elijah didn't know what it was, but he knew, with a certainty that felt almost physical, that Walter had left it for him. And he knew something else, something colder and more practical. He knew that Victor Hale and Ridgeline Partners wanted this land badly enough to spend 15 years trying to get it. He knew that they had bought every surrounding property. He knew that they had offered Walter over $1 million and been refused. And he knew that in 30 days, if he couldn't find a way to pay $87,000 in back taxes, they would take it anyway. Elijah looked at the note one more time. Then he looked at the orchard. Then he started walking toward the trees. The first night in the farmhouse nearly broke him. Elijah had no electricity, no running water, and no heat. The October wind came through the gaps in the walls like a living thing, cold and relentless, rattling the loose boards and whistling through the collapsed section of the second floor. He found a wool blanket in an upstairs closet that smelled of cedar and mothballs and wrapped himself in it on the kitchen floor, his back against the old cast-iron stove, listening to the house creak and settle around him like a ship at sea. He didn't sleep. Every sound was amplified by the darkness and the silence. Mice scratched inside the walls. An owl screamed somewhere in the orchard. And underneath it all, so faint he might have imagined it, there was a low, rhythmic groaning sound, as if the earth itself were breathing beneath the foundation. He lay there with the note in his pocket and the Polaroid pressed against his chest, and watched the moonlight move slowly across the cracked kitchen ceiling. And he thought about Walter. He thought about the last time he had seen his grandfather, a memory so old it had the texture of a dream. He was 7. It was August. Walter had driven him to the winesap mother tree, the oldest and largest apple tree on the property, a gnarled, magnificent giant that Walter claimed was over 100 years old. Walter had lifted Elijah onto the lowest branch and told him to look out across the orchard. "What do you see?" Eli Walter had asked. "Trees," Elijah had said. Walter had shaken his head. "You see, Time," he said. "Every one of those trees was planted by a cross. Your great-great-grandfather planted the first row in 1902. Your great-grandfather planted the Honeycrisps in 1931. I planted the Arkansas Blacks in 1968. And one day, you'll plant yours. That's what this land is, Eli. It's not dirt. It's a clock. And as long as a cross is standing on it, the clock keeps running. Elijah had not understood those words when he was 7. He understood them now, lying on the floor of the farmhouse at 18, with 30 days to keep the clock from stopping forever. At dawn, Elijah got up, splashed his face with water from a plastic jug he had filled at the gas station down the road, and walked into the orchard. The morning mist clung to the trees like gauze, and the fallen apples crunched under his boots. He needed to find the winesap mother tree, and he needed to count 12 rows east. But the orchard was nothing like he remembered. The neat, ordered rows Walter had maintained were gone, swallowed by a decade of unchecked growth. Branches from neighboring trees had intertwined and fused together. Volunteers, saplings, and wild undergrowth had sprung up between the rows, blurring the lines between them. Ivy and Virginia creeper had climbed the trunks and woven through the canopy, turning sections of the orchard into dense, impenetrable thickets. Finding any specific tree in this wilderness was going to take days. Elijah started walking anyway. He moved through the orchard systematically, beginning at the southern boundary and working his way north. He was looking for the winesap mother tree, and he knew from memory that it was massive, much larger than the others, with a trunk so thick a grown man couldn't wrap his arms around it. He also knew it was near the center of the property, close to where the old pump house stood. By mid-morning, he had covered perhaps a third of the orchard and found nothing. The trees all looked ancient and overgrown, their identities obscured by neglect. He was standing in a particularly dense section, breathing hard, sweat running down his back despite the cold, when he heard the sound of an engine coming up the dirt road. Elijah froze. He crouched behind a low stone wall that ran along the edge of one of the orchard rows and watched as a black Suburban with tinted windows rolled slowly up the driveway and parked in front of the farmhouse. 2 men got out. The first was tall and silver-haired, wearing a dark overcoat over a shirt that was too white and too pressed for the middle of the Virginia countryside. He moved with the calm, proprietary confidence of a man who was accustomed to owning things. The second man was younger, thick-necked, in a polo shirt and khakis, carrying a clipboard and a digital camera. He began photographing the farmhouse from multiple angles. The silver-haired man walked up to the front porch, peered through the boarded windows, and then turned and surveyed the orchard with a long, slow, appraising look. Elijah didn't need to guess who they were. He already knew. Victor Hale and one of his associates from Ridgeline Partners. Elijah stayed hidden behind the stone wall, barely breathing, and watched. The younger man finished photographing the house and walked toward the barn, snapping pictures of the collapsed roof and the condemned notice posted on the door. Hale remained on the porch, making a phone call. His voice carried in the cold air, fragments reaching Elijah in the trees. The kid filed the paperwork, Hale was saying. He actually claimed it. No, I don't think he has the money. Torres at Macklin gave him the standard 30-day window. After that, the county moves to auction and we submit our bid. I want the environmental survey completed before then, so we can file the hazard injunction as backup. A pause. Hale looked out at the orchard again, and something in his expression changed. It wasn't greed exactly. It was urgency, a tight, compressed impatience that didn't match a man who was simply waiting for a county auction to play out. Yes, I know about the old man's refusal, Hale said, his voice dropping. I offered him $2 million, and he laughed in my face. He knew something, and whatever it was, he took it to his grave. I don't care about the trees. I care about the subsurface rights. The geological survey from 2019 flagged anomalies on the northeast section, and I need to know what's under that ground before anyone else starts digging. Just get the survey crew up here next week. If the kid's squatting in the house, we'll have the county remove him on the condemnation order. Hale hung up. He took one last look at the orchard, then got back into the Suburban. The younger man jogged to catch up, and the vehicle rolled back down the driveway, disappearing around the bend. Elijah stayed behind the wall for a long time after they left. His mind was racing. Subsurface rights. Geological anomalies. Hale wasn't just trying to build a distribution center. He wanted what was under the ground. And Walter had known. Walter had known. And he had buried something in 1974, and he had refused every offer and every threat for 40 years to keep Victor Hale and everyone like him away from it. The urgency Elijah felt before had doubled. He wasn't just racing the tax deadline anymore. He was racing Hale's survey crew. He needed to find that mother tree. He needed to count 12 rows east. He needed to find the stone that didn't belong. And he needed to do it before Ridgeline Partners figured out that Walter's secret wasn't just a rumor. Elijah worked through the rest of that day and into the next, methodically cutting through the overgrowth with a pair of rusted pruning shears he found in the barn. He cleared brush, identified tree varieties by their bark and leaf shape, and slowly began to reconstruct the original grid of the orchard in his mind. On the second evening, while resting against a stone wall at the western edge of the property, Elijah noticed something he had overlooked. Carved into one of the wall's capstones, almost invisible beneath a layer of lichen, was an arrow. It was crude but deliberate, chiseled into the limestone with a tool, and it pointed northeast. He scraped the lichen away with his thumbnail and found, beneath the arrow, 2 letters, W.C. Walter Cross. Elijah followed the direction of the arrow. It led him along the stone wall for roughly 200 yards, and at the wall's end, where the stones gave way to open ground, he found a second carved arrow on a fence post, this one pointing uphill. Walter had left a trail, not obvious enough for a stranger to notice, but clear enough for someone who knew to look. On the third day, he found it. The winesap mother tree stood near the center of the property, at the top of a gentle rise that overlooked the entire valley. It was unmistakable. The trunk was enormous, easily 6 feet in diameter, its bark deeply furrowed and dark as charcoal. The canopy spread outward in every direction, shading a circle of ground nearly 40 feet across. The lower branches were as thick as the trunks of younger trees, and several of them had grown so heavy that they had bent down to the earth and rooted themselves, creating natural arches of living wood. Elijah pressed his hand against the trunk. The bark was rough and warm, even in the October chill, as if the tree were generating its own heat. He stood there for a moment, feeling the solidity of it, the sheer stubborn permanence of a living thing that had been standing in this spot for over a century. Then he turned east and started counting rows. The rows in this section were easier to identify because the mother tree's root system had kept the undergrowth at bay. 1, 2, 3. The rows stretched down the slope toward the eastern boundary of the property, where the land dropped off into a wooded hollow. 4, 5, 6. The trees thinned slightly here, and the ground became rockier. 7, 8, 9. Elijah could see the remains of the old pump house now, a small stone structure with a rusted tin roof, half-collapsed and overgrown with honeysuckle. 10, 11, 12. Elijah stopped. He was standing in the 12th row, a line of ancient stamen apple trees so old their trunks had twisted into spiraling, almost sculptural forms. The ground here was different. It was harder, more compacted than the surrounding soil, and scattered with stones of various sizes, most of them the same gray limestone that was common throughout the Shenandoah Valley. But one stone was not the same. Elijah saw it immediately. It was sitting at the base of the third tree in the row, half buried in the earth, partially covered by a mat of dead leaves. It was flat, rectangular, and a deep reddish-brown color that was completely unlike the pale gray limestone everywhere else. It was sandstone, Elijah realized. Red sandstone, the kind that was quarried in the western part of the state, not found naturally in this valley. Someone had brought it here deliberately. Elijah knelt beside the stone and brushed the leaves away. It was about 2 feet long and 18 inches wide, roughly the size of a large paving stone. There were no markings on the surface, no initials, no dates. But when Elijah tried to lift it, it didn't move. It wasn't just sitting on the ground. It was set into the ground, mortared in place around its edges with a ring of concrete that had been carefully colored and textured to blend with the surrounding soil. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make this stone look like it had always been there. Elijah sat back on his heels and stared at it. His heart was hammering. He thought about Walter's note. Look for the stone that doesn't belong. What I buried for you. 1974. He needed tools. He walked back to the barn and spent an hour digging through the collapsed remains of Walter's workshop. He found a heavy pry bar, a masonry chisel, a claw hammer, and a shovel with a cracked handle that he reinforced with duct tape from an ancient roll he found in a coffee can full of nails. He carried everything back to the 12th row and knelt beside the red sandstone. He positioned the masonry chisel against the edge of the concrete ring and swung the hammer. The first blow cracked the silence of the orchard like a gunshot. Birds erupted from the canopy above, wheeling against the gray sky. Elijah swung again. The concrete was old, but it was well made, and it resisted. He worked the chisel around the entire perimeter of the stone, chipping away the mortar in small, stubborn increments, his hands blistering inside his thin gloves. It took over an hour. When the last section of concrete finally crumbled away, Elijah wedged the pry bar under the edge of the sandstone and pushed down with everything he had. The stone lifted with a grinding, scraping sound, tipping up on its edge and then falling backward into the dead leaves with a heavy thud. Beneath it was a square hole, lined with poured concrete walls, roughly 3 feet across, and descending straight down into darkness. The air that rose out of the hole was cold, far colder than the October afternoon, and it carried a smell that Elijah couldn't immediately identify, something metallic and dry, like the inside of an old bank vault. Elijah pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. He aimed it down into the hole. The shaft descended about 8 feet, with iron rungs set into one wall, forming a crude ladder. At the bottom, he could see a concrete floor, and on that floor, something large and square and covered with a heavy canvas tarp that had been roped down with steel cable. He was looking at a buried chamber, hand-poured concrete, carefully constructed, completely invisible from the surface. Walter had built this. Walter had dug this hole, poured these walls, set these rungs, and lowered something down into the earth in 1974, and then he had sealed it with a sandstone cap and concrete mortar and spent the next 50 years making sure no one ever found it. Elijah climbed down. The rungs were solid, barely rusted, testament to the quality of the iron Walter had used. When his feet hit the concrete floor, the sound echoed in the small chamber, a flat, dense thud that told him the walls were thick. The chamber was roughly 8 feet square and just tall enough for Elijah to stand upright. The air was dry and still, perfectly preserved by the sealed concrete and the stone cap above. The canvas tarp was military grade, the kind of heavy, waterproof material used for equipment covers. The steel cables holding it down were fastened with padlocks, 4 of them, each one bearing the same brand, Master Lock, in a style that Elijah recognized from vintage hardware catalogs as being manufactured in the early 1970s. He didn't have a key, but he had the pry bar. He wedged it through the shackle of the first padlock and twisted. The old metal resisted, groaned, and then snapped with a sharp crack. He repeated the process 3 more times, the sound of breaking metal ringing in the enclosed space. When the last cable fell away, Elijah grabbed the edge of the canvas and pulled. The tarp slid off with a dry, rasping sound, sending a cloud of fine dust into the beam of his flashlight. Underneath was a safe. It was enormous, a commercial-grade floor safe, the kind used by banks and businesses in the mid-20th century. It stood about 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, made of solid steel, painted a dark green that had dulled to almost black in the decades since it was sealed underground. The brand name was embossed on the front in raised letters, Mosler, one of the most respected safe manufacturers in American history, the same company that built the vault doors for Fort Knox. The safe had a combination dial in the center of its face, flanked by a heavy T-shaped handle. The dial was pristine, untouched by the moisture and corrosion that would have destroyed a lesser piece of engineering. Walter had chosen this safe deliberately. He had chosen something built to last centuries. Elijah stared at the Mosler safe in the cold, still air of the underground chamber, and he felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement of understanding that rearranged everything he thought he knew about his grandfather. Walter Cross was not a crazy old man who refused to sell his land out of stubbornness. Walter Cross was a man who had been guarding something so valuable and so important that he had buried it 8 feet underground in a hand-built concrete vault and spent 50 years living in poverty above it, enduring condemnation notices and tax liens and the contempt of his neighbors and the predatory circling of men like Victor Hale, rather than risk anyone ever finding it. And now Walter was dead, and the safe was here, and Elijah was standing in front of it with no combination, no key, and 27 days before the county auctioned the land out from under him. He climbed back up the iron rungs and sat on the edge of the hole, his legs dangling into the darkness, and thought. The combination had to be somewhere. Walter wouldn't have buried this safe and left no way for Elijah to open it. The note in the Bible had led him here, step by step, with the precision of a man who had planned for this moment. There had to be another clue. Elijah spent the rest of that day and the entire next day searching the farmhouse. He went through every drawer, every shelf, every book in Walter's modest collection. He checked behind picture frames and under loose floorboards. He tapped walls for hollow spaces and examined the fireplace bricks for hidden compartments. He found nothing that looked like a combination. On the third evening, exhausted and frustrated, Elijah sat at the kitchen table and picked up the Bible again. It was a King James version, old and well-worn, with a cracked leather cover and pages so thin they were nearly transparent. Elijah turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight, its solidity. Walter had been reading this Bible when he died. The note had been inside it. Maybe the Bible itself was the next clue. He began flipping through the pages, slowly, carefully, looking for any mark, any underline, any marginalia that might stand out. Walter had not been a man who wrote in books, but Elijah noticed that certain pages had been dog-eared, their corners folded down with deliberate precision. He cataloged them. Genesis 19, Exodus 7, Psalms 4, Proverbs 1, 19, 7, 4, 1, 19-7-4-1. Elijah's breath caught. He counted the dog-eared pages again. For pages. For numbers. He stared at the sequence. 19-7-4-1. A Mosler safe of that era used a 4-number combination. Elijah grabbed his flashlight and ran back into the orchard. The moon was up, fat and white, casting silver light through the bare upper branches of the apple trees. He dropped into the underground chamber and knelt in front of the safe. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the dial. He spun it to the right. 19 left, 7 right, 4 left, 1. He gripped the heavy T-handle and pulled. Nothing. The handle didn't move. Elijah let out a breath that was half sob, half curse. He tried again, more carefully this time, making sure each number was precisely aligned with the indicator mark on the dial face. Right to 19. 2 full turns left, stopping at 7. 1 full turn right, stopping at 4. Left to 1. He pulled the handle. This time, something deep inside the safe mechanism gave a heavy, satisfying clunk, the sound of massive steel bolts retracting from their housings. The handle turned. The door swung open. The inside of the Mosler safe was lined with the same military-grade canvas as the tarp that had covered it. And it was full. Elijah moved his flashlight across the contents, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. The safe was divided into 3 compartments. The top compartment contained a thick leather portfolio, the kind used by architects or artists to transport large documents. Below that, the middle compartment held row after row of small, heavy, individually wrapped objects, each one about the size of a deck of cards, wrapped in dark oilcloth and packed tightly together. There were dozens of them. The bottom compartment contained a single wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with a brass clasp. Elijah reached for the leather portfolio first. He unzipped it and slid the contents out onto the floor of the chamber. There were documents, old and brittle but perfectly preserved by the dry, sealed environment. The first document was a deed. Not the deed to the orchard, which Elijah already held, but a deed to something else entirely. A mineral rights claim filed with the Rockingham County Clerk's Office in 1971, granting Walter Marshall Cross exclusive subsurface mineral and resource extraction rights to the entirety of the Cross Orchard property, extending to a depth of 500 feet. Elijah read it twice to make sure he understood. Walter didn't just own the land. He owned everything beneath it. The next set of documents were geological survey reports, professionally conducted, dated 1972 and 1973. They were dense with technical language, but the summary pages were clear enough for Elijah to understand. The surveys had identified a significant deposit of rare earth minerals beneath the Cross Orchard property, concentrated in the northeast section, exactly where Victor Hale's 2019 survey had flagged anomalies. The minerals included neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, elements that in 1973 had been scientific curiosities, but that in the modern era were essential components in smartphones, electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, and military defense systems. The global market for rare earth minerals had exploded in the 21st century, and the supply was almost entirely controlled by a single foreign nation. A domestic deposit of this size, on privately owned land with clear mineral rights, was not just valuable. It was strategically significant. Elijah set the surveys down. His hands had stopped shaking. A strange calm had settled over him. The calm of someone who has just realized that the ground they are standing on is not what they thought it was. He reached for the middle compartment and unwrapped one of the small oilcloth packages. Inside was a gold bar. It was small, about 4 inches long and 2 inches wide, stamped with a serial number, a purity mark of 9999, and the logo of Johnson Matthey, one of the world's premier precious metal refiners. It was heavy in his hand, dense and warm, catching the flashlight beam with a soft, buttery glow. He unwrapped another gold bar, identical to the first. He counted the packages in the compartment without unwrapping them all. There were 48 bars of pure gold, each weighing what felt like 10 ounces. At current market prices, Elijah estimated he was looking at approximately $900,000 in gold bullion alone. Enough to pay the back taxes 3 times over. Enough to hire lawyers. Enough to fight Victor Hale on level ground. But it was the wooden box in the bottom compartment that brought Elijah to his knees. He unclasped it and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a single sealed envelope and a cassette tape. The envelope was addressed, in Walter's handwriting, to Eli. He opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, written on lined notebook paper in Walter's careful, blocky handwriting. The same hand that had labeled the Polaroid, the same hand that had written the note tucked in the Bible. Elijah sat on the cold concrete floor of the underground chamber, his back against the Mosler safe, and read it by the thin white beam of his phone's flashlight. My dear Eli, I have been waiting to write this letter for a long time, and I am sorry that you are reading it without me sitting beside you to explain everything face to face. I wanted to be there. I planned to be there. But the body is a traitor, Eli, and mine has been betraying me for years now. And I have come to accept that the day you open this safe, I will already be in the ground. So this letter will have to do what I cannot, and I will try to make it enough. First, you need to know why your mother took you from me. Diane didn't leave because she was angry at me or because I did something wrong. She left because she found out about the surveys. In 1972, I hired a geological firm out of Charlottesville to test the subsurface of the orchard. I had noticed strange mineral deposits in the well water for years, colors and textures that didn't match the limestone aquifer everyone else in the valley draws from. The survey confirmed what I suspected. There is a significant vein of rare earth minerals running beneath this property, concentrated under the northeast section but extending across nearly 30 acres. At the time, I didn't fully understand what I had found. Rare earths were not the strategic resource in 1973 that they are today. But I knew enough to file for mineral rights and to keep the surveys locked in this safe. Your mother found the survey documents in my desk before I could secure them. Diane was always sharp, sharper than people gave her credit for, and she understood immediately that the land was worth far more than anyone knew. She wanted me to sell. She wanted the money. She said we could split it and live comfortably for the rest of our lives. When I refused, she became furious. She said I was a selfish old fool sitting on a fortune while my family struggled. And when I still refused, she took you. She took you to punish me, Eli. She took the only thing I loved more than this orchard, and she used you as leverage to try to force my hand. It didn't work. Not because I didn't love you. I loved you more than every tree on this property combined, and losing you was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But I knew that if I sold, the land would be gutted. The orchard would be destroyed. 100 years of cross-family history would be bulldozed and paved over, and everything my grandfather and my father and I had built would disappear. And I knew something else. I knew that the minerals would still be there when you were old enough to make your own choices. I knew that if I could hold the land long enough, you would come back. You would come back because you are a cross, and crosses don't abandon their ground. So I held. I held through the tax liens and the condemnation notices and the offers from developers. I held when Victor Hale came to my door the first time in 2008 and offered me $400,000. I held when he came back in 2012 and offered $800,000. I held when he came back in 2016 and offered $1, $2 million, and threatened to have the county seize the property if I didn't cooperate. I held because every year I held was a year closer to you coming home. The gold in this safe is my insurance policy for you. I bought it slowly, over decades, converting small amounts of cash from the orchard's apple sales into bullion through a dealer in Richmond. It is enough to pay the back taxes and hire a lawyer. Use it for that first, Eli. Pay the taxes, secure the land, and then find yourself a geologist and a mineral rights attorney who are not connected to Victor Hale or anyone in this county, because Hale has people everywhere. The cassette tape in this box contains my recorded testimony, my voice, describing the full history of the surveys, the mineral rights filing, and the harassment I received from Ridgeline Partners over the past 15 years. I recorded it because I knew that if something happened to me, Hale would try to erase the record. The tape is my witness statement from the grave, Eli. Use it. One more thing. Do not hate your mother. Diane is weak, not evil. She wanted an easy life, and I couldn't give her one. She made a terrible choice when she took you. But she is still your blood, and carrying hatred for her will poison you the same way greed poisoned her. Let it go. You have better things to build. I am proud of you, Eli. I have been proud of you since the day you were born, and I have been proud of you every day since, even the days I couldn't see you, especially those days. Take care of the orchard, take care of the land, and take care of yourself. Love, Grandpa Walt. Elijah set the letter down on his knee. The flashlight beam wavered as his hand trembled, casting unsteady shadows across the concrete walls of the chamber. He sat in the silence for a long time. The tears came quietly, without sound, rolling down his face and dropping onto the notebook paper, blurring the pencil marks at the edges. He wasn't crying from sadness, not entirely. He was crying because for the first time in 11 years, he felt seen. Walter had known. Walter had known that Elijah would come back, had known it with a certainty so absolute that he had staked 50 years of his life on it. He had endured poverty, isolation, condemnation, and the slow dismantling of his body and his reputation, all to keep this ground intact for a boy he hadn't seen since he was 7 years old. That was not stubbornness. That was faith. Elijah folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He picked up the cassette tape and held it in his palm, feeling its weight, its smallness, the fragility of the plastic casing that held his grandfather's voice, a voice he hadn't heard in over a decade. Then he climbed out of the chamber, replaced the sandstone cap as best he could, and covered it with leaves and brush. He walked back to the farmhouse in the dark, carrying the leather portfolio, one gold bar, and the cassette tape. He left the rest in the safe. It had been sealed for 50 years. It could wait one more night. The next morning, Elijah hitched a ride to Harrisonburg and walked back into the office of Grace Torres. He placed the gold bar on her desk. Torres stared at it. She picked it up, tested its weight, examined the Johnson Matthey stamp and the purity mark. She looked at Elijah with an expression that fell somewhere between disbelief and something that might have been admiration. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "My grandfather left it for me," Elijah said. "There are 47 more. I need to pay the property taxes today, and I need you to recommend a mineral rights attorney who has no connection to Ridgeline Partners or anyone in Rockingham County." Torres was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to the county tax assessor's office, requesting the exact payoff amount for the Cross Orchard lien. The second was to a woman named Dr. Catherine Albrecht, a mining and mineral rights attorney based in Richmond who had spent 20 years litigating subsurface claims against corporate developers across Appalachia. Torres handed Elijah the phone. Catherine Albrecht had a voice like gravel and honey, blunt and warm at the same time. She listened without interruption as Elijah described the safe, the geological surveys, the mineral rights deed, and Walter's letter. When he finished, there was a pause. Then Albrecht said something that changed the trajectory of the next 6 months. "Young man," she said, "if what you're telling me is accurate, you are not sitting on a pile of gold. You are sitting on one of the only verified domestic rare earth mineral deposits on private land in the eastern United States. The strategic value of that deposit, in the current geopolitical climate, is not millions. It is billions. And if Victor Hale has been trying to acquire your property without disclosing the existence of those minerals to you or to the county, he has committed approximately 14 state and federal violations that I can think of off the top of my head, and I haven't even had my coffee yet." Albrecht drove to Elkton the following day. She was a tall woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair cut short and practical, wire-rimmed glasses, and the demeanor of someone who had spent decades being underestimated and had learned to weaponize it. She examined the geological surveys in the underground chamber, photographed the mineral rights deed, and took custody of the cassette tape for forensic audio authentication. She also brought with her a licensed gold dealer from Richmond who authenticated and appraised the 48 gold bars on site. Total value at current market prices, $947,000. Torres filed the tax payment the same afternoon, clearing the $87,412. 31 lien in full and removing the property from the county auction schedule. When the payment hit the assessor's office, the clerk called someone. Within 2 hours, Elijah's phone, now equipped with a prepaid service plan purchased with a small portion of the gold proceeds, rang. The caller ID showed a Charlottesville area code. Elijah answered. "Mr. Cross," a smooth, controlled voice said. "This is Victor Hale. I understand you've paid the outstanding taxes on your grandfather's property. I'd like to meet with you to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding the future of that land. I have a very generous offer that I think you'll find compelling." Elijah looked at Catherine Albrecht, who was sitting across from him at the farmhouse kitchen table, reviewing documents. He put the phone on speaker. "What kind of offer, Mr. Hale?" Elijah asked. Hale paused, recalibrating. His tone shifted to something warmer, more paternal, the voice of a reasonable man offering guidance to a naive teenager. "The property is in terrible condition, son. The house is condemned, the orchard is dead, and the land itself has limited agricultural value. But I'm prepared to offer you $1. $5 million for the deed, free and clear. That's life-changing money for a young man in your position. You could go to college, buy a home, start a real life. Think about it." Albrecht leaned forward and spoke directly into the phone. "Mr. Hale, this is Catherine Albrecht, attorney of record for Elijah Cross. My client declines your offer. Furthermore, I want to inform you that we are in possession of geological survey reports dated 1972 and 1973 confirming a significant rare earth mineral deposit beneath the Cross Orchard property, along with a recorded mineral rights claim filed by Walter Cross with the Rockingham County Clerk in 1971. We are also in possession of a recorded statement from Walter Cross detailing a pattern of harassment, coercive offers, and coordinated pressure involving your firm, Ridgeline Partners, and officials within the county assessor's office over a period of 15 years. I will be filing a formal complaint with the Virginia Attorney General's office and the U.S. Department of the Interior within the week. Any further contact with my client should be directed through my office." The line went dead. Albrecht smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just set a trap and heard it snap shut. The next 3 months unfolded with the grinding, relentless precision of a legal machine. Albrecht filed complaints with the Virginia Attorney General, the Department of the Interior, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. She subpoenaed Ridgeline Partners' internal communications, which revealed that Hale had been aware of the rare earth deposit since at least 2014, when he had commissioned his own private geological survey of the adjacent properties and extrapolated the mineral veins trajectory beneath the Cross Orchard. His entire 15-year campaign to acquire Walter's land had been predicated on concealing the true value of the subsurface rights from the owner, a textbook case of fraudulent inducement. The FBI opened an investigation. The county assessor who had inflated Walter's tax lien to accelerate the foreclosure timeline was arrested and charged with corruption. 2 of Hale's associates were subpoenaed, and one of them, facing the prospect of federal charges, turned state's witness and provided a complete account of Ridgeline Partners' strategy to acquire the Cross Orchard through financial coercion. Victor Hale himself was indicted on 12 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and violations of the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. His bail was set at $2 million. The silver-haired man who had stood on Elijah's porch with the proprietary confidence of a man who owned the world was photographed being escorted from his Charlottesville office in handcuffs, his face gray and slack, his silk tie loosened, his $400 shoes scuffing against the pavement as federal agents guided him into the back of a black SUV. The news traveled through Elkton the way all news travels through small towns, fast and distorted and electric with opinion. The old-timers at the hardware store on Main Street, the same men who had called Walter Cross a fool and a hermit for decades, suddenly remembered him differently. They remembered his quiet integrity, his refusal to be bullied, the way he had held his ground when every force in the county was pushing him off it. They told stories about Walter to the reporters who descended on Elkton in the days after the indictment, stories that were half true and half invented, but all of them ended the same way, with a grudging, retroactive respect for a man they had dismissed while he was alive. The irony was not lost on Elijah. The same community that had let Walter die alone in a condemned house was now claiming him as one of their own, rewriting history to put themselves on the right side of a story they had never bothered to be part of. Elijah didn't correct them. He didn't have the energy for bitterness, and Walter wouldn't have wanted it. But he noticed. He noticed, and he remembered, and he filed it away in the same quiet, careful way Walter had filed away his mineral rights, without fanfare, without anger, but with absolute clarity about who people really were when it cost them nothing to look away. Elijah watched the news coverage on a small television he had set up in the farmhouse kitchen, powered by a generator Albrecht had arranged. He felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. He felt tired. He felt relieved. And he felt, more than anything, that Walter was somewhere nearby, nodding slowly, the way he used to nod when a graft took hold on a young tree, quiet and unsurprised, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. The mineral rights assessment, conducted by an independent geological firm contracted through Albrecht's office, confirmed what the 1972 surveys had suggested. The rare earth deposit beneath the Cross Orchard was extensive, spanning approximately 28 acres at a depth of between 60 and 300 feet. Preliminary estimates valued the extractable minerals at between $1.8 billion and $2.4 billion at current market prices, making it one of the most significant domestic rare earth discoveries in decades. The Department of Defense expressed immediate interest. Within weeks, Elijah was contacted by representatives from the Department of Energy, 3 multinational mining corporations, and 2 United States senators. Albrecht handled all communications, shielding Elijah from the avalanche of attention with the ferocity of a woman who had seen too many young clients overwhelmed by sudden wealth. She structured a long-term extraction lease that would allow responsible, environmentally managed mining of the deposit while preserving the surface integrity of the orchard. The lease generated an initial signing bonus of $14 million, with royalty payments projected to exceed $40 million annually once extraction began. Elijah Cross, who 4 months earlier had been sleeping in church doorways and eating gas station sandwiches, was now one of the wealthiest 18-year-olds in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He did not buy a sports car. He did not buy a mansion. He did not leave Elkton. He hired a structural engineer and a team of carpenters to rebuild the farmhouse from the foundation up, preserving the original footprint and as much of the original material as could be salvaged. The cast iron stove was restored. The kitchen table where Walter's Bible had rested was refinished and returned to its place. The cracked linoleum was replaced with wide plank oak flooring milled from timber harvested on the property. The roof was rebuilt with standing seam metal, and the porch was reconstructed with hand-hewn posts that matched the originals. He hired an arborist, a quiet, patient woman named Ruth Nakamura, who had spent her career restoring heritage orchards across the mid-Atlantic. Ruth walked the property with Elijah for 3 days, cataloging every surviving tree, assessing root health, pruning damage, and varietal integrity. Of the original 1,913 trees Walter had counted on the Polaroid, 1,416 were still alive. Ruth said it was remarkable. She said the root systems of heritage apple trees were among the most resilient organisms on Earth, capable of surviving decades of neglect and still producing fruit if given the chance. They began the restoration in spring. Elijah worked alongside Ruth and her crew every day, learning to prune, to graft, to read the subtle signs of disease and vigor in bark and leaf and bud. He planted new trees in the gaps left by the dead ones, choosing the same heritage varieties Walter had favored: winesap, Arkansas black, stamen, and a few rows of Albemarle pippin, a variety native to Virginia that had been Thomas Jefferson's favorite apple. By midsummer, the orchard was unrecognizable. The undergrowth had been cleared, the rows restored, the irrigation ditches rebuilt. The trees, freed from the choking grip of ivy and wild growth, spread their branches into the open air and produced a modest but beautiful first crop of apples, small and imperfect, but real. He also established the Walter Cross Foundation, a nonprofit funded with $5 million of the initial lease bonus, dedicated to providing emergency housing, legal aid, and vocational training for homeless youth in the Shenandoah Valley and across Virginia. The foundation's first project was a transitional shelter in Harrisonburg, a clean, well-built facility with 20 beds, a kitchen, showers, and a resource center staffed by social workers and legal advocates. Elijah visited the shelter on its opening day, walked through the rooms, and placed a small framed photograph on the wall of the main hallway. It was a copy of the Polaroid, a boy on an old man's shoulders, an orchard behind them, and beneath it a brass plaque that read, "Everyone deserves a roof that belongs to someone who loves them." It was during the harvest that Diane came. Elijah was on a ladder in the 9th row, picking stamen apples and placing them carefully into a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, when he heard a car engine laboring up the dirt road. He climbed down and walked to the edge of the orchard. A rusted Buick sedan was parked in the driveway, its engine ticking in the heat. A woman stood beside it, thin and sun-weathered, wearing a floral blouse that didn't quite fit and clutching a purse against her stomach with both hands. She looked smaller than Elijah remembered, smaller and older and profoundly uncertain, the way people look when they arrive at a place they know they have no right to be. Diane stared at the restored farmhouse, at the rebuilt porch, at the orchard stretching out green and orderly behind her son, and her face crumpled. She didn't speak at first. She just stood there, her mouth working, her eyes filling, the purse clutched against her body like a shield. Elijah walked toward her. He stopped about 10 feet away. He looked at his mother, and he saw what Walter had described in the letter. Weakness, not evil. Fear, not malice. A woman who had wanted an easy life and had made terrible choices in pursuit of it, and who was now standing in the wreckage of those choices, looking at the son she had thrown away and the fortune she had tried to steal, both of them flourishing without her. "I saw the news," Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the minerals. About the land. About the arrest." She swallowed. "I thought maybe." She stopped. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Elijah knew what she had come for. She had come for money. She had come because the news coverage had made it impossible to ignore what her son now possessed, and because Carl Brecker's car dealership had gone under 2 years ago, and they were living in a rental outside Roanoke, and the bills were piling up. She had come because greed was a reflex for her, as involuntary as breathing, and she couldn't help herself even now. Elijah looked at her for a long time. He thought about the night she had dragged him onto the Greyhound bus. He thought about the apartments and the boyfriends and the years of silence. He thought about the garbage bag and the deadbolt clicking behind him on his 18th birthday. And then he thought about Walter's letter. "Do not hate your mother. Carrying hatred for her will poison you the same way greed poisoned her. Let it go. You have better things to build." Elijah took a breath. "You can't have the land," he said. "You can't have the mineral rights. You can't have the gold or the lease money or any part of what Grandpa Walter left for me." He paused. Diane's face tightened, preparing for rejection, for the door to close the way she had closed it on him. "But I'll make sure you and Carl don't lose your house," Elijah continued. "I'll set up a trust that covers your mortgage and your medical insurance. Not because you deserve it. Because Grandpa Walt told me not to carry what you did to me, and I'm choosing to listen to him." Diane stared at him. The tears came then, real ones, not the performative kind she had always been so good at producing. She opened her mouth to say thank you, or to apologize, or to say something that might have bridged the 11-year chasm between them. But Elijah shook his head gently. "You should go," he said. And she did. She got back into the rusted Buick and drove down the dirt road, and Elijah stood at the edge of the orchard and watched her go, and he felt something release inside his chest, a knot that had been tightening for over a decade, finally loosening. Not because she had earned forgiveness, but because he had chosen to stop carrying the weight of her failure. Carl Brecker never came to the orchard. Elijah learned through Grace Torres that Carl had seen the news coverage and had attempted to contact Elijah through 3 different attorneys, each time claiming a legal right to a portion of the estate as Elijah's former stepfather. Each time, Catherine Albrecht sent back a single-page response citing the relevant Virginia statutes that made the claim laughable, and Carl, Confronted with the reality that the boy he had thrown out with a garbage bag was now represented by one of the most formidable attorneys in the state, retreated into the same silence he had always used as a weapon. Only now it was the silence of a man who had nothing left to say. By autumn, the orchard was producing its first real harvest. Elijah had partnered with a regional cider maker to process the heritage apples into small batch cider, sold under the label Cross Orchard, 1902. The first pressing produced 800 gallons. It sold out in 3 weeks. Local restaurants in Harrisonburg and Staunton began placing orders. A food writer from Richmond drove up to the valley to write a feature, and when she tasted the Arkansas black cider, she said it was unlike anything she had ever had, dry and sharp and deeply complex, with a finish that tasted like cold October mornings and wood smoke. She asked Elijah how he had learned to make cider. He told her he hadn't. He told her the trees had been making this cider for 100 years, and all he had done was stop getting in their way. The article ran 2 weeks later under the headline, "The Orchard That Refused to Die." It never mentioned the minerals or the billions beneath the soil. It was about the apples, and about the boy who came home to tend them, and about a grandfather who had believed in both. Elijah cut the article out and taped it to the refrigerator in the farmhouse kitchen, next to the Polaroid. Elijah stood on the porch of the rebuilt farmhouse on a Sunday morning in late October, exactly 1 year after he had received the email from Grace Torres. The air was cold and clean, and the orchard was on fire with color, the leaves turning gold and crimson and deep burgundy against the blue of the Shenandoah sky. The winesap mother tree was visible from the porch, its massive canopy glowing amber in the early light, its branches heavy with fruit. A thin column of smoke rose from the restored chimney behind him, and inside the house, the cast-iron stove was warming the kitchen the way it had warmed it for 100 years before. The Bible was back on the table, closed now, its work done. The dog-eared pages had been smoothed flat. The note was framed and hanging on the wall beside the front door, where Elijah could see it every time he left the house and every time he came home. Elijah held a cup of coffee in one hand and the old Polaroid in the other. He looked at the photograph, at the 7-year-old boy on the old man's shoulders, at the orchard stretching out behind them, and he understood now what Walter had meant when he said the land was a clock. It wasn't just about time. It was about continuity, about the idea that some things are worth more than money, worth more than comfort, worth more than a lifetime of sacrifice, because they connect the past to the future in a way that nothing else can. Walter had held the land for Elijah. Now Elijah would hold it for whoever came next. He walked down the porch steps and into the orchard. He walked to the 12th row, to the spot where the red sandstone cap lay flush with the earth, now permanently sealed with a bronze plaque that read simply, Walter M. Cross. 1940 to 2024. He planted. He held. He waited. Elijah knelt beside the plaque and placed his hand flat against the cold stone, the way Walter used to press his palm against the bark of the trees. He stayed there for a while, listening to the wind move through the orchard, listening to the apples drop softly into the grass, listening to the quiet, patient sound of a clock that was still running. Then he stood up, put the Polaroid back in his pocket, and walked deeper into the trees. The morning light filtered through the canopy in long golden shafts, illuminating the rows ahead of him, row after row stretching into the distance, each one planted by a cross, each one still standing, still bearing fruit, still reaching upward. Somewhere beneath his feet, billions of dollars worth of rare earth minerals waited in the dark. But above the surface, the apples were ripening, and the leaves were turning, and the roots were holding fast, and that was enough. That had always been enough. There were new rows to plant before the ground froze. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And for the first time in his life, Elijah Cross had all the time in the world to do it. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I don't want you to miss what's coming. See you in the next story.